What's the most fed up thing you've ever walked in on? Story 1. Went bar hopping with some friends a while ago, and one of the girls in the group had a habit of running off when she got drunk and getting into trouble. As soon as we realized she was gone, everyone split up to look for her. I went to check the restrooms. The bar we were in had one restroom for both guys and girls, but multiple stalls. I found a stall with the door slightly open and heard strange noises from inside. I figured she must be sick in there, so I pushed the door open. It wasn't her. It was actually 3 people engaged in an unexpected situation. I slowly backed out, had a cigarette, and called it a night. Story 2. 2 things. First was around 2000. I went for a job interview, and apparently no one told the guy who was supposed to interview me that I was coming. Some of the guys from the company pointed me to his trailer, and me being 19 and clueless, just knocked twice and walked in. Well, this big guy was sitting with his legs up, watching something inappropriate loud enough that I knew what was happening. Thankfully, I didn't have the right angle to see anything directly. I apologized and walked straight out of there. I wanted no part of that job. The second time, I got hired as a deckhand for a tugboat, probably about 6 months later. I walked on the boat, and the first thing you see when you enter is the galley. I noticed some pots with white powder on the side of them, and instantly recognized a familiar smell. I had tried certain substances before, and knew exactly what was going on. The captain and the mate were clearly up to something illegal. So, I called the company and let them know I appreciated the offer, but I wouldn't be working for them. I wasn't going hundreds of miles offshore with people like that in charge. No thanks. Story 3. A couple of years ago, I went to my grandparents' house because I needed some tools I was sure my grandpa had in his garage. I was greeted by Grandma, who told me Grandpa was in the garage doing some work. All good so far. I walked to the garage in the backyard, opened the door and said, "Hey, Grandpa, do you remember that Oh no. Oh no. Grandpa was very busy watching some vintage 80s videos on a dusty old TV. I backed out immediately, pretty shocked, and just walked home. We lived close to each other. Small town. When I got home, I found my brother, looked him straight in the eye and said, "Dude, I just saw Grandpa doing his thing to some vintage tapes in the garage." We stood silent for a second and then burst into uncontrollable laughter for a good 5 minutes. Tears were rolling down our faces. Grandpa was 90 at the time. If at that age you still have the willpower to entertain yourself, then hey, good for you. We never spoke about the incident again, and Grandpa never mentioned it either, but boy, the next family reunion was something else. Story 4. It's been a while since I shared this. A walking-in story from a party we had when we were all about 17 to 18. A couple of hours in, everyone had arrived except one of the birthday girl's best friends. She eventually called and asked if she could bring a guy she met at a club. His name was apparently Sketch. About half an hour later, they showed up pretty drunk. After about 15 minutes, we realized they had disappeared upstairs. The birthday girl didn't want them fooling around in her bedroom, but no one wanted to walk in on them either. So we sent the drunkest guy at the party to go get them. He stumbled upstairs and about a minute later came back down looking pale and disturbed. He sat down and we asked what happened. He said, "I went up and opened the door and he was with her, and then he looked at me, and I think he was a vampire. There was blood all over his mouth, so I left." Turns out they had started fooling around and it became clear it was her time of the month, but Sketch decided to carry on anyway. We had accidentally sent the one person who, in his state, was completely unprepared to process that. He looked absolutely wrecked for the rest of the night. Story 5. My pregnant wife had a diabetic seizure in our bed after I got home from work. I can honestly say I never knew fear before this. Full story below. It was a typical day. I went to work early in the morning. At the time, I was working for a call center we jokingly referred to as Hell X. During this time, my wife was about 7 months pregnant with our daughter Zelda. Yes, we are huge nerds and even ensured her initials came out to ZOD. She had many ups and downs with her blood sugar because of the pregnancy. So I always made sure she had her medical supplies and snacks with her, just in case. After a long day of hearing people complain about candy bars and processing a couple hundred emails, I finally clocked out and headed to our little apartment near the downtown Wilkes-Barre Square. As I walked towards our door, I heard my wife screaming incoherently in pain. I froze for a brief moment, thinking she may have gone into labor. I immediately unlocked the door and ran inside. To my absolute terror, my wife was lying in our bed, flailing her arms and legs violently while foaming at the mouth. She had taken a nap, and during that time, her blood sugar had dropped into the low 20s. There are two types of diabetic seizures, the mild shaking kind and the extremely violent kind. This was the first time I witnessed one of the violent ones, and with it also threatening our unborn child, it only amplified my fear. I quickly calmed myself, grabbed a glucagon shot, and ran back to her. I injected her in the thigh and started massaging the area so it would absorb faster. After about 2 minutes of uncontrollable shaking, she finally came back. She and the baby were fine, and now our little girl is 4 and healthy as ever. Needless to say, that was the scariest moment of my life. And I've been in a lot of frightening situations, from car accidents to skydiving, but nothing shook me like that moment. Story 6. I was a flight paramedic at the time. Our helicopter was down for maintenance, so I joined a ground unit at 3 a.m. to respond to an abdominal pain emergency with their crew. We arrived to find a man in his late 50s sitting on the bathroom floor in his underwear, which were no longer white. There was fresh and dried blood all over him, the floor, and the side of the bathtub. It looked like a crime scene. We honestly thought he had been shot. His skin was pale, but he was totally awake and alert. He said the abdominal pain had been severe but intermittent since midnight, and that he had started throwing up blood shortly after. As he was talking, he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, got a blank stare in his eyes, opened his mouth, and large clots of blood just started pouring out. No gagging, no heaving, just a steady flow. It was one of the freakiest things I'd ever seen. About 20 seconds later, he snapped out of it and resumed talking as if nothing had happened. We did what we needed to do and transported him to the ER quickly. I described what happened at the scene to the ER physician. When we entered the patient's room, the doctor began his assessment. As the patient was talking, he suddenly got that same blank stare and had another round of blood clot vomiting, exactly like before. The doctor looked at me and said, "Well, I've never seen anything like that before, and I've seen a lot. I still get chills thinking about it, and this happened over 15 years ago." Story 7. I used to work at a grocery store from ages 16 to 18. Mostly as a bagger. We had a few employees with special needs, and they were all great, but one in particular often got himself into trouble. We'll call him Adam. Adam had a habit of spending a lot of time in the restroom during his shifts, sometimes up to 2 hours at a time. Usually our managers would ask his job coach to retrieve him, but on one occasion, the coach was unavailable, so I was asked to go get him. What I walked in on was nothing short of astonishing. Not only had he been hanging out in the bathroom for hours, he had apparently found a way to pass the time. He was completely undressed, lying on the floor with his clothes neatly folded next to him. The worst part? He had taken a few of the employee graduation photos, ones we had posted to celebrate staff milestones, and brought them in with him. It was one of the most unexpected things I had ever witnessed at work. Story 8. Oh man, I've got this one. This happened maybe 15 years ago, at a very tame house party with just a few people. There were maybe 6 of us, and it was supposed to be a quiet, friendly get-together. One guy got very drunk, and quickly. He started getting confrontational and rude, so we told him to go chill out in another room. About 30 minutes later, we checked in on him and found him asleep. We figured he was out for the night and left him be. The party went on, and a few hours later, a few of us got hungry and decided to walk into town for a late-night Subway. It took us about an hour to get there and back. When we returned, the house was dark, and everyone had either gone home or gone to bed. We crept in quietly and turned on the front room light. The guy who had been passed out earlier was now lying face down on the floor, pants around his ankles, and a Barbie doll was, well, let's just say it was in a place it absolutely shouldn't have been. We saw it, turned the light off, and backed out of the room. This was back when camera phones were rare and expensive, so no one even thought of taking a photo. But if it happened now, you better believe it would have gone viral. We went to sleep elsewhere in the house. In the morning, the guy was gone, but the Barbie doll was still there. The party host quietly cleaned up the remains, and none of us ever brought it up again. Story 9. I used to live in a really rough neighborhood. Like, seriously rough. So one day, 7-year-old me got tired of playing safely in the gated community streets with my friends and decided to go out through a tree that was growing over the gate. There was a store just 1 block away where I could buy candy. I gathered my gear, an old blanket turned into a rope, and with some help I climbed outside. Well, it just so happened that the local militia was executing someone. I heard a scream and ran to see what was happening, just in time to see 5 men, 2 holding a guy against the wall, 1 cutting his stomach open, and another one overseeing everything. I arrived just in time to see his intestines hit the floor. I was in shock. I just stood there, not even realizing what I was witnessing. The militiaman in charge noticed me. He stopped everything and walked over to me. He was very polite. He knelt down and asked me my name and where I lived. Then he picked me up and walked me back to the entrance of my community, handing me over to the security guard. He never threatened me. I actually felt kind of safe around him. But then again, he had just been in the middle of gutting a man. So, story 10. I used to have roommates. One was a massive, angry woman who worked at a bar. The other was a super chill and genuinely cool guy. One day I came home from work, opened the door, and not 10 feet in front of me, I saw my roommate, 6 feet tall, very slim, engaged in a very intimate act with his much larger boyfriend. They were fully geared up, leather, accessories, the works. That was definitely not something I expected to see. Oh, and another time, I came home to find the same female roommate throwing a party. I went into my room to play some video games and found 2 guys hooking up on my bed. She would always complain if I left a plate in the sink, but she was fine with letting people use my room like that. She was truly one of the most two-faced and frustrating people I've ever lived with. Story 11. I had a friend who lived in an apartment during college with 2 other people, a guy and a girl. The girl wasn't paying her rent and had a pet bunny she didn't take care of. My friend spent most of his time either in his room or out of the house because being around the other 2 was so toxic. They were always fighting. Eventually, things boiled over, and the guy jokingly told my friend that he threatened to harm the bunny if the girl didn't pay up. At the time, my friend and I were out, but when we returned to the apartment, we found that he had actually gone through with it. He had beaten the bunny with a bottle, skinned it, and hung it upside down in the shower to drain the blood. He was wearing the pelt on his head with the most disturbing grin on his face. After draining the body, he cooked and ate it, then left the bones out on the table for the girl to find when she came home. Karma caught up with him quickly. He later hit and killed a pedestrian with his car and fled the scene. They caught him on camera, and he's now in prison. Story 12. This happened when I was in secondary school. We were both in year 9. I was hanging out with a mutual friend at the time, and we decided to go over to this guy's house to see if he wanted to hang out, maybe smoke a joint or something. We got there, knocked on the door, and his mom let me in, saying he was upstairs. I went in alone and headed upstairs. I checked his room, no one there. So I went to his brother's room. I opened the door, and I was stunned. His brother was lying on his back with his legs in the air, and my friend was fully engaged in an act with him. My friend turned and looked at me, and I froze like a deer in headlights. His brother ran past me to the bathroom, and I quickly left the house. I explained everything to my friend outside, and we walked away in silence. Later, that guy told everyone at school about it and blamed me for spreading it. Maybe don't do that with your own brother then? We stopped hanging out after that. Story 13. So, for starters, I am deaf, hard of hearing. This is important to remember. So like 5 to 6 years ago, my mom was in the hospital. She has since passed away. She had been there for weeks, recently recovering from cancer surgery. She shared the room with another woman. The other woman was pretty loud and demanding, so much that even I could hear her sometimes shouting. One day I was seated, playing Bejeweled on my phone, I think, while her son and daughter were near her bed. I was just in my chair doing my thing, but occasionally glanced at them because they were kind of shouting at her and crying. I thought maybe they were having some argument or something. I shrugged and continued playing. About 15 minutes later, my mom asked me to move her. She wanted to get out of the room. I did so grudgingly because my mom was in a state where moving was the last thing she needed. But when we were outside the room, she looked at me, kind of worried, and told me that the woman had just died. And it was better if we were outside so her family could say their final goodbyes. And I was like, what the heck? Someone died 2 meters away from me, and I was playing on my phone and didn't even notice. No one, nurse, doctor, anyone, was called, at least not that I noticed. I know I'm deaf and somewhat absent-minded, but come on. I asked my mom, and she very calmly, She had worked in a hospital for 35 plus years, told me that the doctors had already informed the family that she would pass away that day or the next. She hadn't told me because she didn't want to make me anxious. There were shortages of beds and rooms, so we couldn't move anyway. There was nothing to do but wait for the woman to pass. I started crying right there, almost hysterical. I think it was because I was thinking about my mom and her illness, and how sudden everything felt. I don't know, I was in shock. We walked a bit. My mom really shouldn't have been out of bed. She was very ill. 2 hours later we returned, and the bed was clean. The woman and her family gone. A few hours later, another lady took that same bed. It had been cleaned thoroughly, and that was it. Some months later, my mom died, but at least we were alone with her, and there were no strangers in the room playing on their phones. It's still really strange and kind of sad when I think about that day. Story 14. I walked in on a guy I know detoxing from Xanax. It was the most bizarre night of my life. In no particular order, he had a seizure on the floor, denied having a seizure, ran from the hospital we took him to, punched a nurse, and headbutted his mom. He was about to tell me and my friend Jake some deep, dark secret, then thought better of it. He literally locked his lips and mimed throwing away the key. He brushed his teeth like 20 times. At one point, he took a sip from a water bottle we gave him and spit it out, asking if it was poison. He accused my friend of being a Cylon from Battlestar Galactica. Never seen the show. Not even sure I spelled that right. At the hospital, his mom asked me and Jake to go back to his condo and let the dog out. The door was locked, so we broke a window. I got cut on the glass. So the night ended with me mentally exhausted and bleeding. There were a few other things that happened, but those are the highlights. Don't do drugs, kids. Story 15. This happened years ago in a city far, far away. I worked late at my IT job in San Francisco. As I entered the city center BART station, someone came running up to the ticket agent at the turnstiles yelling that his buddy was hurt and needed medical help. The agent and I went to the stairs that go all the way down to the BART level. I looked down and saw a man sprawled out on the stone floor with a pool of blood around his head. I ran down the steps and started giving first aid to the best of my limited ability. The agent called for police and EMS. A doctor up on the Mooney level was shouting helpful instructions, but wouldn't come down. The stairway had a wall with a handrail, and the wall was only about 5 feet tall. This intoxicated person had been walking on top of the wall and fell off to the stone floor below. He had fractured his skull and was bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth. I kept him conscious and immobilized until help arrived. A freelance camera crew showed up way before police or EMS. At the time, I thought that was the most messed up part of the night. But a couple months later, I was contacted by a lawyer from BART who wanted to depose me. Turns out the guy was walking on the wall, but one of his buddies had pushed him. And now the injured guy was suing BART. Story 16. I was working Meals on Wheels transportation in a very rural area. It was a bad, snowy day, and I was running an hour behind schedule. I had just finished food delivery and was starting on medical appointment pickups. I pulled up to the first client's house, an elderly male. The snow was coming down fast. I backed in and got out of the vehicle. I noticed a snow-covered pile next to my car that didn't look right. I cleared some of the snow off and noticed a foot. I panicked and began frantically digging, thinking the man had fallen and couldn't get up. But as I cleared more snow, blood started showing, a lot of it. When I reached his head, what was left of it, I also cleared his arm to check for a pulse and found a gun. He had taken his own life in the driveway, not wanting to make a mess in the house for his kids. He scheduled a fake appointment so someone would find him. But because of the weather, it ended up being delayed, and the result was worse, truly traumatizing. I don't remember much about that day, just flashes. I do remember having to be driven home. Yes, the man was a regular, a veteran. Navy, I think. He always wore a hat with his ship's name. Story 17. I was playing in the front yard with friends when I was in 3rd grade. Several emergency vehicles sped past my side street onto the main road and killed their sirens just as they passed. So we figured we'd go see what was going on. It turns out an older brother of a classmate, he was 15, was taking his girlfriend for a ride on his new dirt bike. He sped across the main road and was planning to cut through a church parking lot that backed up to the local trails. The preacher was tired of kids cutting through the lot on their dirt bikes, so he put up a cable across the entrance, with no markers on it. Yep, you guessed it. When we got there, his body was in a giant pool of blood. His head was about 20 feet away, still in the helmet. His girlfriend was screaming and tearing her shirt, trying to press the pieces onto his neck like she could save him. The police pulled her away. The fire department hosed the blood into the grass. EMTs loaded the body onto a gurney, and a cop found a cardboard box and placed the helmet, with his head still in it, on the gurney. That was over 45 years ago, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. Story 18. I don't know if this counts as me walking in. It's more like driving next to. Last year on Super Bowl Sunday, I was driving back to my university around 10:30 p.m. I live in Ohio, and there was a snowstorm that day. While driving on Ohio 117, I was behind a life flight ambulance. The roads were slippery, and snow was falling hard. We were going about 45 to 55 miles per hour when the ambulance hit a patch of black ice and started swerving. It went off the road, barrel rolled into a field, and slid about 30 to 40 yards. I stopped my car, after sliding myself, and ran into the blizzard to help. I checked on the driver and passenger. They were okay. I tried to climb up to help them out, but they got out through the passenger door, which was now facing up. The driver yelled, "We need to help the guys in the back," and opened the side door, now the top of the vehicle. I heard a blood-curdling scream and felt my stomach drop. Other civilians had stopped to help too. We opened the back of the ambulance while a woman and a man held the door. I climbed inside to help another man who wasn't strapped into a seat. He was lying at an angle, partly inside a cabinet. The driver and I grabbed him by his belt. He must have weighed at least 300 to 350 pounds, and moved him to a more stable spot. Meanwhile, another EMT in the back was trying to unbuckle his seatbelt with blood all over his face, likely from impact. The female EMT grabbed supplies from the now upturned cabinets. When we got the heavy man onto a more stable platform, he started screaming, and blood poured from his mouth, forehead, and the back of his head. When he opened his mouth, I swear all his front teeth were gone, just empty, bloody sockets. He tried to fight us off, and I'm pretty sure his leg or ankle was broken too. They asked me to hold on to his legs while the other two restrained his upper body and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. The female EMT cut open his right pant leg, then inserted a needle, I think near or under his knee, to administer ketamine and fluids to calm him down. Meanwhile, the civilian woman was on the phone with 911, struggling to give them our location. She was from Georgia and unfamiliar with the area. I told her we were on State Route 117, just north of Huntsville, right after Fion and Classic Swing, a local winery. Eventually, the fire department, sheriffs, and another ambulance arrived. I gave a statement and left to watch the Eagles beat the Patriots. As crazy as it sounds, the adrenaline rush was incredible. It was my senior year and I was majoring in criminal justice. I've always wanted to help others, and that event solidified it. I found out a few weeks later that the man had been life-flighted due to internal brain hemorrhaging, but he survived. It felt amazing knowing I helped save someone's life. Story 19. A close friend of mine died by suicide in February. I was basically his local next of kin. His parents were elderly and far away. So I was in touch with the police and real estate agents, which meant I went with them to assess the house and look for important documents like his will. I expected the house to be clean. My friend was obsessed with keeping things neat, but I'll never forget walking in and feeling the weight of what he must have gone through. The house was destroyed. Plants and soil were everywhere, vomit all over the bathroom. Then I remembered the voicemail he left me before he passed, where he mentioned cutting his gas lines. He had tried to blow up the house. The carpet and furniture were burned in places, windows were shattered, and everything inside was frozen under a thin layer of ice from when the firefighters hosed it down days earlier. The last thing I did before leaving was run my hand across the beam where I knew he had taken his life. There was a groove in the wood from his weight. I stood there in silence. Future residents may never even notice it unless they know what happened there. Story 20. A 20-year-old guy was stabbed in the chest in the center of town, in a parking lot. We witnessed two individuals slashing tires, jumping on the roof of the victim's car, and then running away. When we ran to the man who had a wound in his chest, he looked us in the eyes for 10 to 15 seconds, mumbled something, and then died. I called the police and emergency services. When the cops arrived, I described the two suspects as best as I could, and they began the search. During that time, the guy's mother, father, and brother arrived. The father looked strong. The brother cried, sitting on the ground. Some friends were freaking out, and the mother, she was fainting every 5 minutes inside the emergency vehicle. Every time she came back to, she'd scream and then faint again. Two officers kept us three, me, the brother, and a friend, aside since we were the first on the scene and key witnesses. An hour later, a higher-ranking officer took us to his car and drove us to the police station to file a full report. As we were leaving the station after the procedures, several patrol cars pulled up and brought those two suspects to the very same station. I said nothing. I was in shock that whole night. 6 months later, we were called to testify in court. After we gave our statements, the suspects pleaded guilty and were sentenced. One was 21 years old. The other, only 14. What a terrible start to life. I was 16 at the time. That sight will stay with me forever. Story 21. When I was 18, my mom picked up my then-girlfriend from the movies around midnight one night. We had just seen Wall-E. After dropping her off, my mom brought me to my buddy's house to spend the night. He and his family were like an extension of mine, welcoming me at any hour, calling me son, always feeding me. Truly great people. I walked in, locked the door behind me, and jogged upstairs to his room. I opened the door and found him sitting with a rifle at his feet, struggling to breathe, with a hole in the right side of his head. He had attempted to end his life that night. He passed away in the hospital the next morning. It's one of the defining moments of my life. I think about him often, though time has dulled the sharpness. It's been over 10 years now. I try to be more kind in my day-to-day life, in hopes that even a smile or a genuine conversation might help someone who's silently struggling. I'm not sure if I believe in an afterlife anymore. This event really shook my beliefs, but I hope you found peace, Chris. If anyone out there needs to talk, please feel free to save this. Don't be afraid to reach out. Story 22. I used to be a cab driver in Orlando. I got a call to pick someone up from a house in one of the working-class neighborhoods. As I pulled up, before I could even put the car in park, a woman sprinted out of the house and jumped into the cab, yelling, "Drive! Drive!" Her face was black and blue. Someone had beaten her badly. Then a man came running out after her. I threw the cab in gear and sped off. The guy jumped into his own car and started chasing us down. He kept swerving, trying to push my cab off the road. It was terrifying. This was not how normal people behave. There was a state trooper barracks a couple of miles away, so I headed straight there. The guy stayed on my tail the entire way. I had to run a couple of red lights just to avoid him. He was in full-blown psycho mode. We made it to the state trooper barracks, and once he saw where we were, he backed off. I guess he realized he wasn't ready to fight me, her, and 20 state troopers. Story 23. I used to be a manager at a $40 a night motel, a place known for some really rough clientele. One of the worst experiences I had was when we had to evict a family of 4. The parents were both in their 70s, and their 2 sons were around 40. The sons complained constantly about their health and said they were having seizures regularly. When we finally kicked them out, I entered the room and was hit by a wall of warm, humid air that smelled like a combination of urine, feces, sweat, and meth. It felt like getting punched in the throat. The bathroom was covered in trash. The toilet had been clogged for who knows how long, and they had continued to use it. There were jugs of urine everywhere, and the carpet was soaked. Trash was piled up so high in some areas that it came up to our knees. They also had a dog at one point, but it had gone missing, and we never found it, even after digging through the garbage. 2 of my employees and I got pricked by needles during the cleanup. All of us threw up more than once. Story 24. Not the most disturbing thing I've ever walked in on. Some things I don't feel comfortable sharing, but this is one I'll never forget. Before our first daughter was born, we asked one of my wife's coworkers to stop by our condo while we were gone and check on our cats. Simple task, just make sure they had food and water in case we hadn't left enough. My wife had been in full nesting mode before we went to the hospital. All the baby clothes were washed, organized, and separated. Doubles of items we had received at the shower were neatly stacked in bags so we could return them. The house was spotless and perfectly arranged so that once we came home with our baby girl, she was all we had to focus on. We sent my mother-in-law back to the condo late at night because she needed rest, and there wasn't room for everyone in the delivery area. Not long after, she called me, wondering what was going on at the condo. Confused, I left the hospital and came home to find the place in disarray. Sheets had been pulled off the bed and crib, stuffed into the washer and dryer, starting to mildew since they hadn't been dried. The comforter was thrown across the downstairs couch. The duplicate clothes we planned to return had all the tags removed and were in various stages of being washed. Half-eaten takeout containers were left open on the counter. The packaging and tags were tossed in a corner. And worst of all, the cats hadn't even been fed or given water. I did what I could. I washed and dried the sheets, remade the bed and crib, fed the cats, gathered up the now non-returnable items, and took out the trash. Then I returned to the hospital. I told my wife that her mom just needed a little help getting settled in and didn't break the news until later. After the birth, while my wife and baby were still in the hospital, I kept going back and forth to get the condo back in order. With help from my mother-in-law, we returned it to a reasonable state before bringing them home, but there was nothing we could do about the ruined duplicates. Looking back, it seems her coworker brought along another person and they decided to help set things up for the baby. But they never finished anything and clearly didn't realize that everything had already been prepared. We suspect they used our bed for something intimate. Why else would someone try to wash freshly made, clean sheets and comforters? Didn't make the same mistake for our second daughter. I stocked up on cat food and water and locked every door. Story 25. I'm a nurse. I've seen some disturbing things over the years. When I first started, I worked in a locked geriatric psychiatric unit. Pretty wild stuff went on there nearly every day. From people smearing things on the walls, to elderly patients getting into fistfights, to some of them engaging in inappropriate behavior in the dining room. It was chaos on a regular basis. All of that became weirdly routine. One day I was passing out medications and preparing to check on a little old lady. She was completely bedridden with end-stage dementia. Honestly, she shouldn't have even been on the unit because most of the other patients were there due to severe behavioral issues. As I entered the room, I saw something that still bothers me to this day. A male patient, completely undressed, was pulling her diaper off and attempting to climb on top of her. He was clearly not in his right mind and had no awareness of what he was doing. The situation was incredibly upsetting. We had to report it, notify both families, and start an investigation. Story 26. One time on a tram, I was sitting next to a young woman who was visibly shaken and crying while talking on the phone. Part of the conversation went, "I see him. He's on the tram. What the hell do I do?" The tram was packed, people heading to work and all. But this woman had the full attention of everyone within earshot. The tram slowed to a stop between stations. Public transport, am I right? And we sat there for a minute. The woman hung up the phone, stood up, and squeezed through the crowd, sobbing, walking up to a man and asking if he recognized her. He looked at her, said yes, and went in for a hug. That's when she yelled, "Don't touch me!" Now the entire tram was focused on them. Over the next 10 minutes, she cried while confronting the man, who, as it turns out, was her mother's former boyfriend and had assaulted her when she was a child. Me and other passengers stood between them to make sure she felt safe and wasn't alone. Until the next stop, the man was completely surrounded by angry strangers. Someone asked if she wanted us to call the police and detain him until they arrived. But she didn't want that for some reason. It was heartbreaking. Story 27. Recently, there were rumors going around the school that someone was vandalizing the boys' bathrooms, missing the toilet entirely with their business. I think I caught the duo responsible. It was the end of break time, and I had gone into the nearest restroom to run my retainer under cold water before putting it back in. I heard two guys in the stalls behind me saying things like, "That all you got? And come on, your aim is weak." All while the sound of liquid hitting the floor echoed around them. That was disturbing enough, but I wanted to be sure before confronting them. So I peeked under the divider between stalls and saw two streams of pee hitting the floor in the gap. All I said was, "Whoever is in there, you two are disgusting." And when they came out, they had the most solemn look of disappointment in themselves I've ever seen. I reported it to the next teacher I saw. I'm sick of people like that getting the bathrooms closed for the rest of us who actually know how to use them. Pretty sure they got suspended. Story 28. I don't know if this counts as something extremely messed up, but it stuck with me. I lived in Vancouver for a year back in 2008 when I was 20. I was at the ferry quay that leads to downtown Vancouver. It was a Saturday night around midnight, and I needed to use the restroom. The public restroom near the boarding deck was awful, but I figured I'd go anyway, since the bus would take a while. I stepped inside and immediately heard what sounded like a teenager on the edge between muffled moaning and desperate crying. I turned around, weirded out, and saw 4 legs shifting around under a stall door. I hurried to finish up, but I noticed the cubicle door was slightly ajar. Inside, I saw what looked like a junior high-age girl with a hand over her mouth and a man behind her yelling, "Get out of here!" The girl looked drugged or dazed. She didn't look 18, and the guy appeared to be in his late 20s. I ran out to look for the nearest security guard or officer. There were none. I checked a nearby McDonald's. Still nothing. Then I spotted some cab drivers and frantically explained what I had seen. 2 of them came with me as I pointed out the restroom. Now I was with 2 Cambodian cab drivers, and we pulled the door open. There was shuffling inside, and when they pulled the man out, he was still mid-act. One of them restrained him, while the other helped the girl who was on her knees. She threw a sock out of her mouth and started kicking the man. Her scream was bone-chilling. The police arrived shortly after and arrested the man. We gave our statements. Since I wasn't a Canadian citizen, I couldn't testify in court. But I later learned the girl had knife wounds on her left side and a deeper cut near her hip. She had been staying with her aunt and uncle after a party, got lost trying to get to North Van, and this guy had helped her toward the ferry. A few years later, I got a letter in the mailbox from her family thanking me. She was 16 at the time. The man was sentenced to 120 years with no bail, charged with multiple serious offenses. I'll never forget that night. Story 29. In my sophomore year of high school, I was on our school's newspaper team. I was the sports editor, but covered other topics when needed. During the last period of the day, we heard a loud explosion and shouting coming from the end of the hallway. Without really thinking about the potential danger, our newspaper teacher told another student and me to run down and see what had happened. Apparently, student safety protocols weren't much of a thing in 1999. So we grabbed the cameras and ran down the hall to cover the story. What I saw still gives me nightmares. There was a burnt smell in the air. What I didn't realize at the time was that it was burnt flesh. There in the hallway was one of my friends and a couple of other students, burned and smoking. Inside the classroom, students were screaming in a way I didn't even know was possible. The chemistry teacher had been conducting an experiment. Something went terribly wrong, and the lab literally exploded in their faces. There I was, camera in hand, seeing my friends severely burned, my 15-year-old self frozen in shock. We ran back down the hallway, yelled into the office that students were hurt, and returned to our classroom. I sat there for the rest of class, just staring at the camera, thankful I hadn't taken any pictures. Thankfully, no one died, but one girl suffered severe burns over much of her body, and several others were injured, though less severely. The girl who was badly burned later married a former addict who had burned himself in a meth explosion. He's clean now. And together they tour schools to talk about overcoming extreme life obstacles. Still, every once in a while, I catch a scent that brings that moment rushing back. Story 30. My dad once wanted to take me, my sister, and our mom to a museum. This was back before navigation apps were really a thing. We arrived at a building that definitely looked like a public institution, but there was no sign or anything confirming where we were. We walked in. People saw us, but no one said anything, so we didn't think we were trespassing. The weird part was that nothing we saw matched my dad's description of what the museum should have contained. We went to the second floor, and it looked like the kind of lab kids imagine when thinking of weird science experiments. There were things in jars, organs, animal fetuses, and similar specimens. Now, this next part might be my young brain exaggerating, but I distinctly remember seeing what looked like a human fetus in one of the jars. Needless to say, that ended the museum trip. We left immediately and went to get ice cream instead. To this day, I have no idea what that place actually was. Story 31. I was about 8 years old watching cartoons on a Saturday morning around 9 a.m. when I decided to go wake up my parents. They were still in their bedroom, which was odd at that hour, and I was a little concerned. I tried the door. It was locked. Luckily, I knew how to unlock all the doors in the house, so I picked the lock and slowly opened the door. Inside, my mom was handcuffed to the bed and gagged, while my dad was involved in a private act over her. He saw me, shouted in surprise, and told me to get out, turning toward me, fully exposed. I immediately left, and the atmosphere in the house was awkward and silent for several days. My parents tried to explain what they were doing, but I already had a vague idea, especially since my mom had previously scolded me for looking at those inappropriate websites. It was uncomfortable, to say the least. Story 32. My friend and I went into his backyard to kick the soccer ball around. This was when I was a kid. He had a German shepherd that they kept chained up in the backyard. It was a long chain. His backyard was shaped like an L, with the longest part facing the back door. We came outside and he called the dog over. Normally it ran right over. This time nothing happened. We noticed the chain was stretched tight, tensed, and disappeared around the corner, out of sight. We followed it to where we had line of sight and saw the chain pulled taut, going up and over the fence. We freaked out and ran around the other side of the fence. The dog was hanging by the chain with a weird, blood-colored mush coming out of its mouth. My friend ran inside and got a butcher knife, then came back and started hacking at the chain, trying to break it. His cousin heard the commotion and came out. He freaked out too. He was the tallest of us, so he could reach the part of the chain attached to the fence. My friend and I had to lift the dead dog up. It was a big German shepherd, and we were only 11 years old, to give enough slack so the cousin could detach the collar from the hook. I'll never forget the sound the dog made. He was definitely gone, but loosening the chain must have shifted something in his vocal cords because it let out a low-pitched groan. We covered him up until animal control came to take him away. That moment is burned into my brain. Tongue out, bloody gunk around the mouth, eyes rolled back. It was horrifying. Story 33. So my friend used to be in a really toxic relationship. Not physically abusive, but mentally. She constantly manipulated and belittled him. He worked full-time while she didn't work at all and used up all of his money without even a thank you. Even though he was working 10-hour days, she sat around playing video games and refused to clean. He tried to keep the place tidy, but eventually gave up since she would just make it worse the next day. That was the final straw, and he broke it off. A week later, I went with him to pick up his stuff since he didn't have a car. That flat was the worst place I've ever stepped into. Honestly, like something out of those Homes from Hell TV shows. They had 2 rabbits and 4 cats. The rabbits were fine, but cat poop was everywhere. The litter trays were overflowing, and it was smeared into the carpet. I almost threw up the second I walked in. She was a massive collector of gaming merchandise, and if it had been kept tidy, some of the stuff would have actually been really cool. But instead, it was scattered everywhere. On the shelves, the floor, under the filthy sofa. There was dust everywhere, and it swirled up when you moved anything. Words can't describe how bad the smell was. That's what really got to me. Story 34. My ex-girlfriend said she had to stay late for a staff meeting. She worked at a high-end restaurant. I was at a friend's place waiting for her to text me when she was ready to be picked up. The whole time, she was Snapchatting me saying things like, "This is so boring and can't wait to leave." It was around 2 a.m. and I'd had a few drinks. On my way home, I decided to stop by her job, thinking there was no way she'd be much longer. The restaurant had big floor-to-ceiling windows. You could see straight inside from the street. I pulled over and watched for a moment. She was at the bar with her boss, no one else around. He walked around the bar and sat next to her. He showed her something on his phone. Then they started kissing. Almost before I could even process it, she dropped to her knees and began performing a Sewell act on him, right there, in front of those big windows. I couldn't let that go on. I turned the car on and drove directly toward the place. The story goes on, but that was easily the most traumatic thing I've ever witnessed firsthand. I never really recovered from it. I got pretty depressed, gained about 40 pounds, and honestly, I've become pretty disconnected from dating and relationships in general. Trust has been really difficult ever since. Story 35. I used to work in a contracted cleanup crew for law enforcement. We were called in to clean up messy crime scenes, anything from robberies to murders. We also handled suics. One time we were called to a suis on a railway. A man had laid with his body outside the tracks and placed his neck directly on one of the rails, leaving his head between the rails. It was clear he intended to decapitate himself. Sure enough, a train came through and did exactly that. His head ended up in the middle of the tracks, white as a ghost, and his body remained where he had positioned it. His neck had been crushed so flat against the rail that it looked paper thin. Once police had finished their part, we had the unpleasant task of removing the remains. When they lifted his body, his neck kind of opened up like the top of a Ziploc freezer bag full of soup. I wasn't the one who moved the body, thankfully. I was off vomiting into the hedgerow. I used to think I had a strong stomach, but that scene was just too much. I retrained, sorry for the pun, after that. Now I work as an electrical safety tester for a housing association. Story 36. My ex-girlfriend overdosed on Hero. She had just gotten out of rehab and was already struggling. A friend of hers had overdosed and died the day she got out, and an ex-boyfriend of hers had taken his own life a few weeks prior. Trying to stay sober through all that was clearly overwhelming, she cried constantly for the first week after leaving rehab. We got back to my apartment after picking her up from her place. As soon as we arrived, she went straight to the bathroom. About 3 minutes later, I heard a loud bang. I assumed it was the upstairs neighbors dropping something heavy. A minute passed and I didn't think much of it. Then for some reason, a story she once told me popped into my head about how her sister had overdosed. She said she knew something was wrong because she heard her collapse and hit the wall with a loud thud. That memory suddenly made me uneasy. I called out to her, just to be sure. No answer. I called again. Nothing. I knocked on the bathroom door. Still no response. Luckily, when I moved in, the bathroom door lock was broken, and I'd replaced it with one that came with a key, which I kept in the hallway closet. I unlocked the door, and there she was, on the floor, face turning blue, barely breathing, pulse frighteningly slow. I called 911. The operator talked me through CPR until the paramedics arrived. She survived. If I had waited even a few more minutes, I don't think she would have made it. I don't consider myself a hero. She started using again the very next day. A few weeks later, she stole money from me and began seeing someone else who lived a similar destructive lifestyle. Still, the image of her nearly lifeless on my bathroom floor will never leave my mind. If you're reading this, don't shame addicts. Try to understand them. Try to show love. That's what they need more than anything. Story 37. I'm a first-time mom. I'm still not used to the kind of love you suddenly have for this tiny little tornado who completely takes over your life. The weight of being responsible for another person's life is something I haven't fully come to terms with yet. Well, just a few nights ago, I went to check on my daughter sleeping in her crib. And I kid you not, there was a giant spider sitting on her cheek. I'm talking mutant size, straight from Chernobyl kind of huge. I'm not even afraid of spiders, but this one, I could see the individual hairs on its legs. I swear I could have braided them if I wanted to. I'm ashamed to admit I stood there frozen for at least 3 seconds, and then suddenly snapped out of it, woke her up, sprinted across the room, and snatched that ugly thing off her face. Since then, I haven't found the spider. It's hiding out somewhere, and I've been completely paranoid ever since. I haven't let her sleep in that room. She's been sleeping in my bed instead. What's worse is now I'm incredibly scared that I'll freeze again if something happens in the future. What if she falls? What if she runs into the street and I just stand there like I did? Honestly, I've walked in on a lot of disturbing things in my life, but the lasting fear from that moment has stuck with me more painfully than anything else. Story 38. I went to church with my family one Sunday. We were visiting my grandma out of town, and it was my first time going to church. My uncle was living with my grandma at the time. He was really quiet and deeply depressed. He was a Vietnam veteran and would spend hours watching C-SPAN in the basement. He barely interacted with us. The only real memory I have of him engaging with me was when he pushed me on a swing once in their backyard. After church, we got back home, and my dad asked me to go downstairs and get my uncle for dinner. I walked to the basement where he always was. I opened the door and found him sitting on the couch, a shotgun between his legs. The barrel rested at the place where his head used to be. There was a hole in the wall, and blood and brain matter splattered everywhere. It was gruesome, but my first thought wasn't about what I had seen. It was about having to tell my dad that his brother was gone. My dad is the kindest, smartest, most loving person I know. He's also incredibly strong. He had been visiting my uncle a lot recently, trying to help him through his sadness. The worst thing I've ever walked in on wasn't my uncle's body. It was the look on my dad's face when he saw mine. He knew instantly. His smile disappeared, replaced with a sadness so deep that it's been etched into my memory ever since. Story 39. I worked at a gas station a few years ago. The restrooms weren't inside the shop. They were around the back of the building. We had a policy that if someone took longer than 30 minutes in there, we had to go check on them. One day, a guy came in and asked for the key. I was busy with customers for nearly an hour before realizing the key was still gone. I figured he had just forgotten to return it, which happened all the time. So I went to the back of the building and heard groaning coming from inside the restroom. I knocked and asked if everything was okay, but there was no response. Just heavy breathing and weird grunting. I assumed he was either having a medical emergency or was high out of his mind. Either way, I had to open the door, per policy. As soon as I did, the smell hit me like a truck. It was the worst thing I've ever smelled, easily 10 times worse than anything I could have imagined. I nearly threw up on the spot. Then I actually saw what was going on. The guy who had taken the key was sitting on the toilet, still in the middle of his business, and his girlfriend or wife or whoever she was sitting on his lap. Her skirt had been arranged to cover what was happening. When I opened the door, she jumped up and ran past me, screaming like she'd witnessed a murder. There I was, standing face to face with a man in the middle of one of the most revolting things I've ever seen or smelled. His pants around his ankles, water still refilling in the toilet bowl, and the saddest look of shame on his face. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, the tiniest little fart slipped out of him. I just stood there for a second and then burst into uncontrollable laughter. I laughed so hard I teared up and had to sit outside on the ground to recover. Story 40. This happened about 7 years ago when I was living in Minneapolis. I had just gotten off work and needed to take 2 buses to get home. My connection point was in a pretty rough neighborhood, but it was only 3 p.m., so I wasn't too worried. After waiting a few minutes, a white van suddenly sped around the corner, and a naked woman came tumbling out of the open door. The door slammed shut, and the van sped off, running a red light in the process. The woman saw me since I was the only other person on the street, and ran straight toward me yelling, "Call the police! Call the police!" I should mention she looked like she had been beaten, and there was blood all over her body. I gave her my coat, Minnesota fall weather, and immediately called the police. Less than a minute later, the same white van pulled up right in front of us. A man got out of the back and walked toward us. When he saw that I had the phone to my ear, he muttered a curse and lifted his shirt to grab a gun from his waistband. I truly thought I was going to be killed right there for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Just as he started to lift the gun, 2 cop cars turned onto the street. The van sped off. One cop car gave chase while the other stopped to help us. I was taken to the precinct to give a statement. I got home hours later and cried under the covers for a long time. I'll never forget the look of absolute terror on that woman's face as she ran up to me. Story 41. My fiancée was in the hospital giving birth. Labor had been going on for about 18 to 20 hours, and I was taking a turn to rest while her mother stayed with her. I woke up to her screaming, turned over, and saw that no one else was in the room. And our son was lying on the platform at the end of the bed, still attached to the umbilical cord. He was blue and not moving. I freaked out and sprinted down the hall trying to find help. The hallway was deserted. I eventually found my way to the NICU and began banging on the door, begging for help. One of the nurses came to the door, and I explained what was happening. She rushed back with me to the room. By the time we got back, our son was awake, crying, and totally fine. His mom had left right before I woke up to get help and had been successful. What I found out later made me furious. My fiancée had told the nurse she felt the baby coming, but the nurse brushed her off and said, "He won't come without some help." I guess our son took that as a challenge and decided he was coming out, right then and there. After the nurse left, my fiancée told her mom something was between her legs. Her mom lifted the blanket and saw the baby's head already out. There was no assistance, no medical support. He just delivered himself. Story 42. Dodge Elementary School in Amherst, New York, 1994. I was a sophomore in high school at the time, hanging out with 4 friends, also former students of Dodge. We had each taken 2 hits of acid. It was around 11 p.m. on a Friday in the summer, and we decided to go to the school's roof, smoke a little weed, and trip together. There were cars in the parking lot and lights on inside the building, which we thought was odd, but we were tripping, so whatever. After spending some time on the roof, we walked around to a darker area on the side of the building. That's when we saw it. Behind a tree in the moonlight, we noticed a guy just switching positions with a woman, going from one angle to another, and then going at it. He was mid-action when they both turned and locked eyes with us. We were teenage boys frozen 10 feet away staring. We all stopped, stared back, and then, unable to hold it together, started laughing hysterically and fell over. One by one, just rolling around in the grass. By the time we pulled ourselves together, the couple was gone. It wasn't a hallucination. This acid wasn't like that. We saw what we saw. Apparently, some faculty or staff had private sessions at the elementary school on weekends. Story 43. I used to work at a small startup company that was trying to replicate the business model of Groupon when it first became popular. It was located in a huge corporate building. I had the early shift, and we had to park across the street in the public parking lot of a massive outdoor mall. One morning, I got out of my car to put my belt on. I was running late, and I heard a loud bang. It was so loud, I honestly thought a car had driven off the top of the parking structure. I went to investigate and discovered a woman barely clinging to life. She had jumped from the top of the 4- or 5-story parking garage. Since it was early in the morning, there were only 2 of us around. Thankfully, the other person nearby was an off-duty firefighter or paramedic. I don't remember exactly, heading into the 24-hour fitness at the mall. He knew what to do. We were the only ones there. I immediately called 911 and flagged down the arriving emergency responders when they got there. They couldn't save her. I watched her paralyzed body let out a single tear before she passed away in front of me. I went into work, told them what happened, broke down, and quit on the spot. I've never gone back to that place since. Story 44. Late to the party, but this one's my old roommate's story. He used to work as a server at a well-known local steakhouse. One day he picked up a shift for a coworker and was serving 2 men, both in their late 30s or early 40s. Everything seemed normal. They were having a regular conversation, ordered a nice meal, spared no expense. Nothing seemed off at all. When my roommate brought them the check and went to the back to grab food for another table, he suddenly heard 2 gunshots. Turns out one of the men was the older brother of the other guy's girlfriend. The boyfriend had reportedly gotten the sister addicted to meth and was also pimping her out. The brother found out and lost it. He shot the man in the head right there in the middle of the restaurant, then turned the gun on himself. According to my roommate, there was brain matter everywhere. Both men were still twitching for quite a while after. One of them was even kicking himself in the chest over and over for a couple of minutes. He tried not to let it show, but I know it really messed him up. Story 45. Walked in on a guy shoving what looked like a pogo stick into the backside of a bull. I was at the vet with my mom, getting one of our horses looked at. Got bored, wandered over to the livestock area, and there they were. 2 guys absolutely in their element, working through an endless line of cattle, one with the Ass Blaster 10,000, the other with a cup on a stick standing at the ready. I just sat there on a bucket and watched them go. They didn't say a word. I figured anyone doing that much, probing probably had more important things to focus on than small talk. As awful as it sounds, it was still more entertaining than listening to my mom and the vet talk about the horse. I'd already seen the entire forearm disappears into a horse's backside trick more times than I could count. It had lost all novelty. At some point, I started to wonder what goes on in the minds of large animal vets, because apparently an arm in the rear is their version of a handshake. If a finger in the bum is an oil check, then this was a full-blown expedition. Later on, I asked the vet what I had actually witnessed. She explained the process of electroejaculation. Apparently, the Ass Blaster 10,000 delivers light electric stimulation to the bull's colon to encourage a sample, while the cup guy waits in anticipation to collect it. The sample gets tagged, stored, and they move on to the next animal. It made more sense after that, but it's still seared into my memory as one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. Story 46. I managed a halfway house for about 9 months after living there for 9 months myself. We'll call one of the residents John. John's parents were coming to pick him up for Thanksgiving so he could be with his family, people he hadn't seen in over a year. His roommate told me that John had been in the bathroom for a while, and his parents were already there waiting. The shower was running, so I knocked to let him know he should probably hurry. When I didn't get a response, I got a bad feeling. I picked the lock and opened the door. He was lying between the sink and the toilet. Foam was coming from his mouth along with blood, from both his mouth and nose. His lips were swollen and purple, face pale. A needle and spoon sat on the sink. This wasn't the first time I had walked in on someone who had overdosed, But it was the first time that person's parents were standing right behind me. His mother screamed immediately. His younger sister, maybe 10 years old, was with her. I will never forget the sounds they made, the look on their faces, combined with the image of how John looked in that moment.